When the early sun climbed over the North African desert, the light hit the dunes at a slant that made every grain of sand look sharp and metallic, as though the land itself were forged for war. In that vast expanse, two minds were about to collide, two generals whose reputations had already begun to take on the weight of myth. One was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, celebrated across Europe for his speed, audacity, and uncanny ability to read a battlefield. The other was George S. Patton, an American who had yet to prove that his theories about armored warfare could match the skill of Germany's most elusive commander. But the desert, so empty and unforgiving, cared nothing for myth or rank. It rewarded only the one who understood it better. Rommel had fought long enough in Tunisia and Libya to know the heat of the desert was as lethal as artillery fire. Engines overheated. Men collapsed from thirst. Even maps lied. On that early morning, he believed he had anticipated everything. From the heights of a low ridge, he assessed the sandscape through binoculars. His staff officers stood around him in a half-circle, their faces half burned by sun, half hidden in shadows under their helmets. Rommel pointed with a gloved finger toward where he expected the Americans to move. "They will come there," he said in a clipped voice. "Patton is bold, but he is predictable. Bold men always are." Patton, at that same hour, paced before a map spread across the hood of a dust-caked jeep miles away. To his officers he spoke as though lecturing cadets at the cavalry school. "Rommel thinks with the logic of maneuver. He reacts to what a man appears to want. So we will want nothing. We will show him signals he expects, then strike where the sand is quiet." His voice carried a whip-like cadence, and even the desert wind seemed to hold still to listen. What unfolded over the next hours would later be told in barracks like a legend. Patton's tanks were not only moving forward, they were disappearing. Rather than charging head-on, they fanned out in two crescents, using the dunes as camouflage. The ground shook as steel tracks burrowed into hills of sand, engines roaring, then choking, then roaring again. Through a spyglass, German officers saw dust clouds and believed they understood the axis of attack. Rommel smiled, not a smile of arrogance, but of confirmation. Patton, he thought, must race, and racing was a fatal temptation. The Italians, armored but fragile, would hold the center while the Afrika Korps maneuvered for the flank. The Americans would be enveloped, then shattered. But no shattering came. The first of Patton's feints hit the Italian line with what felt like half a division of tanks, but there were fewer vehicles than dust clouds suggested. Then came artillery, brutally timed. Shells detonated with concussive force that set the dunes trembling like sheets of cloth in a storm. Italian tanks burned, their smoke ascending in sickening spirals. German officers cried out for counterorders, and Rommel raised his hand for calm. This was not yet decisive. Patton had created a distraction. The Desert Fox knew distractions like a gambler recognizes loaded dice. Yet somewhere in the haze of smoke and sand, Rommel began to sense an absence. The Americans were loud where they were weak and silent where they were strong. A runner arrived breathless, reporting that German scouts had sighted armored columns far to the southwest where there should have been nothing but desolation. Rommel narrowed his eyes. "Patton is hunting," he murmured. He mounted an armored car and ordered it to advance. The vehicle bounced violently over the dunes, and dust lashed at his face despite his goggles. He studied the horizon. The desert was a vast chessboard, but unlike chess. The pieces moved under clouds of deception. Patton had read Rommel's books. Rommel knew this. He had once respected the idea that an opponent would study him, learn from him. Now he wondered whether, in being studied, he had become predictable. It was a dangerous thought, and he pushed it aside. By noon the desert had become a furnace. Engines overheated and water rations shrank. Patton pressed his tankers harder, pushing them in a wide arc intended not to encircle Rommel but to deceive him into thinking they meant to. Medium tanks skirted ridges, popping up just long enough to be counted. Patrols vanished as though swallowed by the earth only to reappear miles away. It was warfare not of thunder but of mirages. Patton's genius that day lay not in overpowering the Desert Fox but in making him question the very ground he commanded. Rommel found himself forced to reposition his reserves. He committed panzers toward the southwest, believing that Patton intended to break there. His staff officers noted the shift nervously. It was unlike Rommel to chase smoke. He sensed their doubt and addressed them with the calm certainty that had made him famous. Patton is ambitious. If he strikes, it will be with concentration, not illusion. Yet as he said it, one of his radios crackled with emergency traffic from the eastern sector. Patton had struck after all, where no one expected. The Americans thundered forward from behind a jagged line of dunes that had masked them like a curtain on a theater stage. The tanks burst forth as though summoned, their guns already loaded. They came not in a single line but in layered waves, high-speed and ruthless. German anti-tank gunners scrambled to position, firing shells that screamed across the sand and tore through the lead vehicles. Explosions threw men into the air. But the Americans kept coming, wheels smoking, tracks grinding, turrets swiveling in coordinated arcs. Rommel realized instantly what Patton had achieved. It was not the tactical blow itself, but the timing. Patton had waited until Rommel's reserves were half committed elsewhere. He had shown his opponent what he wanted him to fear, then struck with what he actually intended. The Desert Fox had been outfoxed on his own battlefield. He ordered his panzers to wheel back, but they were too far, and the terrain made speed impossible. Patton had arranged the battle to make Rommel slow, something no enemy had ever succeeded at before. Rome and Berlin would later write it as a miscalculation, but those who were there said it felt more like magic. Even German veterans swore that day they had watched the desert itself betray them. As the afternoon wore on, the battlefield became a storm of fire. Tanks burned until their steel frames warped. Men crawled across dunes to find shade that did not exist. The Americans surged, then pulled back in controlled withdrawals, refusing to let the Germans counterattack on fixed positions. Rommel paced along the ridge, his boots sinking into hot sand. He urged his radio operators to maintain contact with units that no longer replied. Silence replaced discipline. When at last the sun dipped to the west, the sky turned red as though smeared by the hand of war. Patton's forces withdrew to reorganize, taking the land they needed and leaving wreckage behind. The Desert Fox watched the battlefield through smoke that irritated his eyes, though no one could tell whether the wetness on his face came from irritation or from something heavier. His chief of staff approached, hesitant. "Field Marshal, shall we prepare a renewed assault at dawn?" Rommel lowered his binoculars. "No," he answered. He turned away from the battlefield, as though acknowledging defeat not to the Americans but to the desert that had once been his ally. Then, quietly, he added, "Patton has read my book." Today he wrote his own chapter. Later that evening, in a tent lit only by a flickering lantern, Rommel confided to a senior officer words that would echo long after the war. "He did not beat me with tanks," Rommel said. "He beat me with ideas. He did what I would have done." Those who heard him claimed his voice carried admiration rather than bitterness, and that was why the remark mattered. For two predators cannot hate one another without first acknowledging the other's skill. Patton, for his part, sat atop an ammunition crate among his men, dust covering his uniform, his helmet dented, and his eyes hollow from exhaustion. Someone handed him a canteen and congratulated him. Patton waved it off. "Rommel is not finished," he said. "He will learn from this. The next time will be harder." In the cold of that desert night, the two men, one German, one American, planned for a rematch they both sensed the war would deny them. History would move toward Sicily, toward Italy, toward Normandy. But in the sands of Africa, among burnt-out tanks and tracks carved through dunes, lay the proof that great generals test one another not for glory but to measure the outer limit of human cunning. Years later, after the war had ended and Rommel had met his tragic fate, officers who served under him recalled that day in the desert with a rare tone reserved only for moments when the world shifts. They remembered what the Desert Fox had said when Patton outsmarted him on his own battlefield. "It is the duty of every commander," Rommel had told them, "to seek an enemy equal to himself. If he finds him, he should be grateful, for only then will he know how good he truly is." That sentiment would drift across time, more durable than banners or medals, because it revealed a truth that war seldom admits: the greatest victories are those that force admiration from one's opponent. And in that desert, between dunes that swallowed the bones of men and machines alike, Rommel had found his equal, and Patton had found a rival worthy of his ambition. The desert remembered both.